Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most important routes in human history. What was the Silk Road, and why did it matter so much? How did it connect people who lived thousands of miles apart, across deserts, mountains, and seas? And what kinds of treasures, ideas, and traditions moved along its paths? The Silk Road was a web of routes that linked China with the Middle East, Europe, and far beyond. Caravans carried silk, spices, and precious goods, but just as important were the religions, inventions, and stories that spread along the way. This vast network of trade and travel connected empires, changed cultures, and left a mark on the world that we still feel today. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you are settling into bed, resting after a long day, or simply curious about the past. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, a teenage emperor sat on the dragon throne in Chang'an and looked west toward deserts and mountains that his maps rendered as little more than blank spaces. Lu Che, who would be remembered as Emperor Wu of Han, came to power in 141 before the Common Era at the age of 16. He inherited a prosperous but cautious realm that had bargained with the riders of the northern steppe for peace, and had paid for that peace in silk and grain. The policy was called Heqin, a marriage alliance and tribute that followed the humiliation of Bai Deng when the founder of Han had been trapped by the Xiongnu near modern Datong around 200 before the Common Era. Emperor Wu judged that this old agreement had bought only a breathing space. The Xiongnu Confederation still raided the frontier and still demanded gifts. If China was to breathe freely, the frontier itself must be moved. He began with geography and logistics, because even an emperor cannot speak to the far horizon without roads and food. To the west of the heartland ran the Hexi Corridor, a long ribbon of loess and oasis wedged between the Chilean mountains and the dunes of the Gobi. Whoever held this narrow passage controlled the door to the Tarim Basin and beyond. The emperor strengthened the line of the Great Wall through that corridor and studded it with beacon towers, fortified posts, and government relay stations called Yi, where fresh horses and rations could be found. Commanderies were planted like stakes to claim the soil. Wu Wei and Juquan were established in 121 before the Common Era after hard fighting. Jiang Ye followed, and then Dunhuang by 111 before the Common Era as the forward hinge of the frontier. West of Dunhuang, the state cut 2 gates through the desert hills, Yumengguan the Jade Gate and Yangguan the Sunny Gate, which together marked the last pillars of the known empire. Granaries were raised at the passes, wells were dug along the dry tracks, and signal fires tied the garrisons to Chang'an so that a message could leap from tower to tower in a single night. Power must also be paid for, and Emperor Wu changed the economics of his dynasty to feed the frontier. He standardized coinage with the Wuzhou copper coin in 118 before the Common Era, tightened state revenues, and soon created state monopolies over salt and iron to capture profit for campaigns. He ordered state farms and soldier settlements in the northwest to grow grain for the garrisons, and he moved convict labor and colonists into the corridor so that the army would not march on empty stomachs. Administrators and engineers counted the miles of road and the bushels of millet as carefully as generals counted arrows. The emperor invited merchants to serve the state as transport contractors on official caravans, rewarding them with rank for reliable delivery. Under this discipline, the frontier hardened, and the line of outposts pushed steadily toward the deserts that the court poets called seas of moving sand. Then came the decision to set aside caution. In 133, before the Common Era, the court designed an ambush at Mai in modern Shanxi to lure a Xiongnu host into a killing ground. The trap misfired when the plan was betrayed, but the die was cast. The Heikin policy gave way to open war. Two great captains rose to carry out the emperor's will. Wei Qing, a careful commander with a knack for logistics, and Huo Qubing, his young kinsman, whose speed and audacity made his name a legend. In a chain of campaigns between 129 and 119 before the Common Era, the Han cavalry struck across the Ordos Loop and into the grasslands, driving the Xiongnu away from the Hexi corridor. The victories of 121 before the Common Era opened Wuwei and Jiuquan. The northern expedition of 119 before the Common Era smashed the enemy in the heart of the steppe and cost Han many horses, but broke the power that had pressed on the frontier for a century. The enemy did not vanish, but the land routes through the corridor could now be guarded, and the emperor's officials began to think beyond defense. What waited beyond the corridor were not only raiders but kingdoms, with markets, orchards, and stables, and rumors that in the far valleys of Daiwan in Fergana there grazed tall, sweating horses whose blood tinged their coats and whose lungs did not fail in the thin air. Chinese chronicles called them heavenly horses and praised their bone and stride. The armies of Han needed such animals for deep operations on the steppe, and the emperor wanted them as a symbol and as a tool. Reports also spoke of bright glassware from the west, of grapes and alfalfa unknown in the Central Plains, and of states called Anxi and Daxia that we know as Parthia and Bactria. To turn rumor into knowledge, the emperor needed eyes and a voice in the far oases. He also sought an ally against the Xiongnu among the Yuezhi people who had been driven west toward the Oxus and the valleys beyond. So he sent an envoy. The man's name was Jiang Qian, a court official with the patience of a farmer and the resolve of a soldier. In 138 before the Common Era, he walked out through the Jade Gate with a handful of attendants and the seal of Han in his luggage. The story of what happened to him belongs to the next part of this chapter, but the decision itself is the hinge on which this whole road would turn. It was the moment when an emperor in Chang'an chose to replace tribute with initiative, and to bind deserts and mountains to his will by law, coin, and garrison. From that choice came commanderies at the edge of the sands, passes that became household names to travelers, and a vision of China not as a closed garden, but as the eastern end of a continent-wide exchange. By the last decades of the 2nd century before the Common Era, the line of forts from the Wei Valley to Dunhuang was complete. The towers were manned, and the beacons were ready. Caravans, under official protection, began to creep beyond the passes to nearby oases to trade silk and lacquer for jade from Khotan and hardy remounts from the western valleys. The emperor's officers recorded the distances and the water points. A day's march in the desert was reckoned by the strength of a camel and the number of skins it could carry. Relay posts were placed according to that arithmetic. Every stone granary and every well dug made the unknown a little less dangerous. When the court finally decided to seize the heavenly horses outright, General Li Guangli marched west in the campaigns of 104 to 102 before the Common Era, fighting at the walls of Ershi in Daiwan, and forcing a treaty that brought the prized animals east, along with grapevines and the seed of alfalfa. Those vines would take root in the river valleys of Gansu, and wine would become a taste of the frontier brought home to the capital. No one in Emperor Wu's court used the phrase Silk Road. That name would be given by a German geographer many centuries later, but the structure that made the road possible took shape in his reign. A disciplined frontier in the Hexi Corridor, the twin gates at Dunhuang, a military that could strike outward, and a treasury that could sustain long supply lines. An envoy sent to pierce the fog of rumor with first-hand testimony. A state that believed distance could be mastered by planning, and that profit could be harnessed to power. In that preparation, you can hear the first faint bell of a caravan. It is the sound of a continent beginning to knit itself together. He left the Jade Gate with a small party and the Emperor's seal, and within weeks the world closed around him. Somewhere north of the Ordo's Bend, he fell into the hands of Xiongnu scouts and was carried to their camps in the steppe. 10 years passed in captivity. He learned the rhythm of a nomad year, the winter pastures and the summer grazing, the sound of felt tents in high wind, and the value of a strong horse, and a full skin of kumis when snow buried the grass. He married a Xiongnu woman and kept his purpose hidden. When a border patrol grew careless, he and a few companions slipped away at night and turned their faces to the sunset. That escape, as much as any decree in Chang'an, opened the road. The land taught him its measure. The desert west of the corridor is a basin rimmed by mountains, the Tarim on the south and the Tian Shan on the north, with the Taklamakan in the middle, a sea of sand where even a shouted name falls flat. The safe way lies along the foothills, where rivers run out of ice and stone and spread into oases. Each oasis is a garden ringed by fields and orchards, a market square and a wall, because beyond the green there is only salt and wind. Zhang Qian moved from water to water, Shanshan, near the marshes of Lop Nor, then the northern route toward Turfan and Kucha, or perhaps the southern string by Khotan and Yarkand. The records do not mark every step, but they remember the names that mattered, because at each of these places the Han court would later station garrisons and place officials, and each would become a knot on the cord that tied China to the west. Past Kashgar, the ground rises and the air thins. The old Chinese called the barrier the Onion Range and meant the Pamirs and their neighboring chains. A caravan must choose its pass according to the season, the snow, and the strength of its animals. The men of Fergana and Bactria used 2 humped camels for high work and small mountain horses that did not tire. The climb takes the breath, and at the top of the passes the world opens to new valleys and new kings. Zhang Qian came down into Dayuan, the land we know as Fergana, a well-watered bowl north of the Alai with cities set among canals and vineyards. The Han histories describe a capital called Urshi, with stout walls and strong gates. The people prized wine and kept it in cellars. They minted coins and valued silver vessels. They bred tall horses that could run at a steady pace for days, and the sweat of those animals sometimes showed red from a parasite that troubled their skin, a small detail that later gave rise to stories of blood in their veins. From Dayuan he learned the map of the Middle Lands. To the west lay Daxia, which is Bactria, around Balkh, a country of merchants and city dwellers. The old Greek kings had fallen there, and the people kept their markets, but lacked a single ruler with a hard fist. They used silver and bronze coins, with the faces of kings pressed on one side and gods or symbols on the other. This was a surprise to a Chinese envoy, who came from a world where value was cast rather than struck, and where the image of a living man was not placed on money. To the northwest lay Kanggu, a confederation of tribes on the middle course of the Seared Daria, half nomad and half settled, raiders and traders in equal measure. Farther west again stood Anxi, Parthia, with many large cities, a strong cavalry, and a habit of guarding the crossroads for profit. Parthian caravans took goods to Mesopotamian towns and down to ports on the Gulf, and from there ships crossed to India. South of Bactria, he heard the name Shendu, the Indus country, which sent cotton cloth, spices and gems along the rivers and roads to the north. The Uezi were his true goal, and he found them beyond the Oxus, settled on land they had taken from Bactrian princes. Their rulers were 5 lords under a greater chief. Their flocks were many, their warriors good with bow and lance, and their councils did not burn to ride back east for revenge. He spoke for Emperor Wu and asked them to join Han in striking the Xiongnu, but they were rich in new pasture and fat trade, and would not be moved by old grudges. He stayed more than a year among them, long enough to see their markets and their marriage ties, and long enough to understand that China would need other friends if it wished to master the steppe. He did not return by the same road without a fight. On the way back, the Xiongnu caught him again and held him, and again he got free. When he finally reached Chang'an in 126 before the Common Era, 13 years had passed since he had gone out through the Jade Gate. He came thin and scarred, and with only a few men beside him, but his news was worth a kingdom. He told the court that there were rich settled peoples across the mountains, and that they hungered for silk. He told them that China's own bamboo staffs and cloth from Sichuan had been seen in Bactria, brought there by merchants from the south who had ferried them through India. That single report revealed to the Han court that their goods already circled the world without them, and that there were more than one road by which value moved. He described the coins, the grapes, the alfalfa, and the strange fruits and customs of each country. He named the distances in days of travel and in lie. He marked the courses of rivers and the places where snow closed the passes. He weighed the strength of horses and the temper of kings. The emperor listened. Within a year, the frontier policy changed from guarded defense to active diplomacy. Envoys went out to Daiwan, to Kangju, to the Wusun in the Ili Valley, and back to the Yuezhi. Each carried silk, lacquer, and gold, and each carried a plan. The Wusun would prove the most willing partner. They were powerful riders who controlled a broad grassland between the Tian Shan and the Balkhash waters. They shared an enemy with Han and wanted silk and marriages to bind an alliance. Over the next generation, Han princesses would travel into the west to cement these ties. Princess Shijun was sent to the Wusun court around 105 before the Common Era, and Princess Jieyu followed later, and those marriages anchored garrisons and tribute routes that held for decades. The court also prepared for force where persuasion failed. When Dayuan refused to hand over the finest of its horses, Han sent General Li Guangli west in the campaigns of 104 to 102 before the Common Era. He forced the surrender of Urshi and cut a treaty that guaranteed a steady supply of the heavenly stock. Along with horses came grapevines and seed for alfalfa, which took root in the corridor and changed the taste of its tables and the feed of its herds. Zhang Qian himself did not retire into silence. He was sent again toward the Wusun, and he pushed a southern line of inquiry as well, down through the valleys of modern Sichuan and Yunnan, to find a road that would touch India and the lands of the Southern Sea. The effort to open that southwestern artery would take years and many lives, but the idea was set in motion by the knowledge he had brought home. He was given titles, then suffered setbacks, then received office again. The chronicles place his death not long after these labors, but his report in the records of the grand historian endured and became the primer for every Chinese envoy who followed him into the oasis. Out of his journey came a way of moving across a continent. The state learned how far a camel could go between wells, how many sacks of millet must be cached at a pass to provision a garrison through winter, how to plot the line of a caravan by mountain shadow and by the taste of a spring. The court learned where a bribe would buy safe passage and where only a squadron of horse would do. The men who followed him learned to skirt the deadly heart of the Taklamakan by splitting into two strings, one along the north past Kucha, Aksu, and Kucha again on the return, and one along the south past Nia, Khotan, and Yarkand, and then to meet at Kashgar before trying the high air. They learned that an early start and a noon rest would save the animals and the men. They learned to repair saddles with rawhide and to wrap feet in felt when frost cracked the sand. They learned the size of the world by walking it. He did not stitch the whole road alone. Parthian traders had been carrying goods between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau long before he rode, and Indian merchants had brought textiles and spices up river routes for centuries. Sogdian families in the Middle Lands would soon take the craft of caravan trade to a new level, building houses and temples in every market town from the Oxus to the Yellow River. But Zhang Qian did a thing that had not yet been done. He gave the Han court a clear picture of the countries beyond the mountains, and he proved that a Chinese envoy could cross and return alive. He turned rumor into a map and a map into policy. After him, the bells of official caravans began to ring, first timidly and then with confidence. The first consignments were mostly gifts, because a gift given in the right court is a letter written in silk. Soon the gifts were wrapped around purchase and sale, and prices settled into patterns along the stations, and the frontier guards found themselves counting bales as often as arrows. When he left Chang'an, the world beyond Dunhuang was a list of fears. When he came back, it was a set of named places with known distances and known appetites. That is how a road begins. Not with a single caravan, but with knowledge solid enough that a cautious minister can send the next party out with a ledger instead of a prayer. When the first Han envoys returned with stories of cities beyond the Pamirs, another court far away was already counting the profit of those roads. The Arsacid kings of Parthia had risen on the Iranian plateau in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and by the 1st century before the Common Era held the string of oases and river valleys that an overland caravan had to cross. Their early capitals at Hekatompelos and later at Ctesiphon sat like hands on a choke point. The Parthian king did not need to ride to China to touch Chinese silk. He needed to tax the men and animals that carried it. The Parthian state understood the arithmetic of a caravan. They kept relay stations where water was trapped in cisterns, marked stages by a day's march of a loaded Bactrian camel, and guarded the places where rivers must be forded. From Merv on the Murgab, a caravan could run southwest to Hyrcania, and then east to the Caspian Gates and the passes near modern Tehran, or swing along the northern skirts of the Elburz toward Regay and Ekbatana. From there, the tracks bent toward Mesopotamia, to Seleucia on the Tigris, and to Ctesiphon on the opposite bank, a twin city that became the Parthian court. Customs houses stood at these crossings. A toll was levied, an oath was taken, a seal was pressed into clay. Parthian satraps were judged by the weight of their receipts as well as by the order in their districts. The empire did not own every mile of the road, but it held enough of the gates to act as broker between the Far East and the Mediterranean. Across the sea at the mouth of the Tiber, the Roman Republic was becoming an empire, and Rome discovered that silk looked like flowing water in torchlight. The Romans knew China only by a name. They called it the land of the Seres, the Silk People, and wrote about them as gentle and distant farmers whose land lay at the end of the world. In the last century, before the Common Era, wealthy Romans began to wear silk threads woven with wool. By the time of the early emperors, people had learned to unwind the thread and weave pure silk cloth. The effect astonished and offended in equal measure. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century, after the Common Era, that Rome sent vast sums of silver to India, Arabia, and the Seres for luxuries that satisfied only women and vanity. He put a number to the drain on the treasury in sesterces and called it a yearly shame. Seneca scolded that a woman wrapped in silk appeared naked because light could pass through the cloth. Tiberius is said to have forbade senators to wear silk in the forum. Aurelian later refused to buy a silk mantle for his wife and told his court that the cost insulted the state. The clamor did nothing to stop the trade. Gold auri and silver denarii still crossed into the east, and silk still flowed back. Most of that silk moved by Parthian hands. The Arsacid kings were archers on horseback when they went to war, but in peace they were keepers of roots. They sat between Rome and the great central exchange at Merv and Balk, and they managed the meeting ground of two worlds. At their western edge stood cities that grew fat on caravan traffic. Palmyra, in the Syrian steppe, rose from a palm oasis to a caravan city of stone with warehouses, tax offices, and a grand colonnade. Its merchants carved inscriptions that listed the places their agents had reached and the duties they had paid. They sent trains of camels to Messene at the head of the Gulf, to Charax at the mouth of the Tigris, and north to the Euphrates crossings near Dura, Edessa, and Nisibis. Antioch on the Orontes served as a great receiving port for silk and spices. From Antioch, bales went by road to the Aegean and by ship to Italy. Petra, farther south, controlled an older incense traffic from Arabia, and its bankers also touched the silk trade when the road bent through their territory. The Parthian court let these way stations thrive so long as their tax farmers balanced the books. Rome and Parthia wrestled for border cities as wolves pull at the same carcass. In 53, before the Common Era, Marcus Crassus led a Roman army into Mesopotamia and was destroyed at Carrhae by Parthian horse archers, who broke the legions with arrows and then crushed them with armored lancers. Mark Antony later tried to answer the defeat and failed. Trajan came with more method a century after and reached the Gulf, took Ctesiphon, and pressed to the old Parthian heartland before the weight of supply forced him back. Hadrian and his successors settled for a defended frontier along the upper Euphrates and for client kings in Armenia. War flared often, trade paused, and then resumed. Even in campaigns, Roman buyers paid Syrian and Palmyrene merchants for goods that had come through Parthia, and Parthian nobles bought bronzes and glassware stamped in workshops along the coast of Syria. Goods moved in both directions, and they tell their own story. Roman glassblowers in the 1st century before the Common Era learned to blow a bubble of glass through a tube, a trick born in the Syro-Phoenician coast that filled the Western markets with clear vessels at a price Sasanian and Indian makers could not match. Those bottles and cups traveled east on camelback and were prized in Central Asian tombs. Roman metalwork and fine woolen cloth went with them. From east to west came the obvious treasure of reeled silk thread, but also varnished wood, lacquer, furs from farther north, musk and aromatics, and paper in small amounts as novelty before it became common. Indian pepper and gems often reached Rome by sea through Red Sea ports, but pepper also appeared at Antioch by the inland route. In return, coins flowed. Hoards of Roman gold and silver have been found in India, where they were sometimes cut and remelted into local forms. Fewer caches survive in Parthian lands, but the movement of specie through Mesopotamia never ceased. Much of the traffic stayed indirect because Parthia had no interest in letting Rome and China meet without a toll. When the Han general Ban Chao reasserted Chinese influence as far as the Caspian, he sent an envoy named Gan Ying toward Dakin, which is how the Chinese wrote the Roman world. Gan Ying reached the Persian Gulf in 97 after the Common Era, and turned back when shipmasters warned him about the dangers of the sea. In the other direction, a party reached the Han court in 166 after the Common Era, and claimed to be sent by the Emperor of Rome, whom the Chinese called Andun. They brought ivory and turtle shell, and had probably come by sea to a southern Chinese port, and then overland to the capital. These rare encounters were less important than the daily rhythm of caravans, but they showed that curiosity moved as readily as cloth. The people who made this exchange possible were specialists. Parthian nobles controlled the customs houses, but the trains belonged to merchant families and guilds who kept agents in every useful town. They hired guides who could judge a sky for weather and a track for danger. They bought 2 humped camels for mountains and 1 humped camels for deserts, and mixed their strings to match the land. They loaded bales according to the strength of the weaker beast, so that the line could keep its pace. They taught their guards to loose arrows from the saddle and to stand a shielded circle around the tents at night. They knew which wells were brackish and which were sweet, and they kept that knowledge as a trade secret. Caravan masters kept accounts in wax and in memory, and balanced them with coins struck at Tyre, at Antioch, and at Ctesiphon, where the Parthian mint put the king's face with a soft cap on the obverse, and an archer seated on the reverse. War did not spare the road, but the prophets of peace often forced enemies to make terms. After a campaign ended and the armies went into winter quarters, Roman and Parthian officials would sometimes reopen the frontier markets at Nisibis or at Zeugma. Rates were posted. A certain number of animals could cross each day. The market towns at the edge of the empires learned that a measured truce could earn more than a bold raid. In those intervals, Rome obtained steady access to silk thread and finished cloth. The empire tried to manage the result through law. Sumptuary measures, under several emperors, tried to restrain the wearing of pure silk by men, and sometimes by all ranks, except the imperial house. The Edict on Maximum Prices, under Diocletian in the early 4th century, after the Common Era, would later attempt to name what a length of silk should cost. None of it did more than acknowledge a desire that could not be taxed into disappearance. By the 2nd century after the Common Era, the outlines of the western half of the road were set. Parthia held the middle, Rome held the Mediterranean door, and a chain of cities from Merv to Palmyra to Antioch lived on the fees, the storage charges, the exchange rates, and the small comforts of a bed and a hot meal sold to men who had walked all day beside their animals. A traveller could stand in the market of Palmyra and hear Greek and Aramaic and Parthian and Latin before the sun set. He could buy a glass cup that had been blown that month in Sidon and a bolt of silk that had been reeled the year before by a woman in the valleys beyond Dunhuang. He could watch a tax clerk weigh a bale on a scale that had been copied from Egyptian models and stamped with a Parthian seal. He could sit in a caravanserai courtyard under a painted ceiling while a storyteller recited the fall of Crassus and a merchant from Edessa argued about the purity of a dye. The Silk Road in this age was a bargain struck under watchful eyes. Rome obtained a cloth that had become a second skin for its wealthy and a symbol of their rank. Parthia took the gold that made rank possible and used it to pay archers and build palaces along the Tigris. Neither side wanted the road to break, even when they drew swords along the border. Between them, the caravans continued to walk, and the world learned to think of value not as a thing made in one place, but as a chain of hands that reached from the vineyards of Italy to the mulberry orchards of Gansu. Silk and glass and spices were not the only wares that moved across the deserts. Words moved, songs moved. A man on foot with a begging bowl and a robe could carry more change in his head than 1,000 camels could hold. Along the caravan tracks of Central Asia, the teaching of the Buddha left the Ganges plains and learned the languages of the oases. The monks walked behind the traders and sometimes ahead of them. At a wayside grove, they would stop, raise a small shrine, and preach in the market square. When the caravan master counted profits under lamplight, a scribe in the monastery next door copied a scripture onto fresh sheets of paper. In time, those leaves would travel as far as the last watchtower in the sands. The first whisper reached China as a court dream in the reign of Emperor Ming of the later Han, around the year 67 of the Common Era. Chinese sources say that the emperor saw a golden figure in his sleep and sent envoys west to ask about it. They returned with 2 monks and a white horse laden with Sanskrit texts. The men were lodged near Luoyang, and a temple was raised there that was called the White Horse Temple. Legend embroidered the event, but the temple stood, and translations began. And that is what matters. The earliest known translators include An Shigao, a Parthian noble turned monk who reached Luoyang around 148 and rendered meditation texts from an Indian language into Chinese, and Lokaksema, who worked in the 2nd century and brought early Mahayana sutras into a script that court scholars could read. The words changed to fit Chinese grammar, and Chinese thought bent to greet the words, and a new door opened in the eastern capital. While the first scriptures crossed the passes, the heart of the work lay in the Middle Lands. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Kushan Empire joined the Oxus valleys to the Indus and set its capital at places like Bagram and Mathura. Under kings such as Vima Kadphises and Kanishka, Buddhism enjoyed royal favor. Tradition says that Kanishka sponsored a great council in Kashmir, where teachers debated doctrine and compiled commentaries. Whether the debates ran exactly as the later chronicles say does not matter as much as the building that followed. Monasteries rose along the trunk roads. The Gandhara region made images of the Buddha with a serene face and a robe that fell in ripples like Greek stone, because artists there had learned old Hellenic tricks from ancestors who served the kings that Alexander left behind. Those statues were carried north to the oases. Pilgrims and traders who had never seen the Ganges could now look upon the Enlightened One, carved in grey schist, and understand the message in stone. The oasis of the Tarim Basin became a rosary of faith. Kucha on the northern rim, with its music and its learned monks, who were praised for clear argument. Khotan on the southern rim, rich in jade, and known for patronage of Buddhist learning by its kings. Kashgar, the meeting of roads that housed shrines for many travelers and many gods. Miran, a smaller post east of Khotan, where a fort and a monastery once stood side by side. Along these stops, the cave temples went into the cliff faces and into river bluffs. At Kizil near Kucha, the 1,000 Buddha caves hold paintings that date from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, painted in mineral blue and red and green. At Bezeklik near Turfan, another 1,000 painted Buddhas watched over travelers and farmers. At Dunhuang, the first monks and artisans began carving and painting the Mogao caves in the 4th century. By the 10th century, the cliff front looked like a honeycomb, with wooden facades and stairways and halls that held colossal statues and delicate murals. Even before that flowering, the cells and small halls were in use as places of refuge and learning. The caves were not built as a single vision. They accreted along with trade, each room a gift of a patron, a memory in plaster of a safe return or a vow fulfilled. Caravans did not separate piety from business. Many merchant families became donors and trustees of monastic establishments, and many monasteries fed and sheltered caravans in return. A caravanserai offered walls and water and stables. A monastery offered a bed and a kitchen and a scripture to hear before sleep. When kings in Kucha or Khotan needed legitimacy, they sponsored translations and summoned monks for debates. When a warlord or a guide needed luck, he left coin and incense before a shrine. In this way, the networks of faith and trade linked at every stage. In dry years, monasteries stored grain that kept a frontier district alive. In good years, temples collected rents on orchards and fields and used the silver to copy texts and repair the roof over a statue. The road gave and took. As Buddhism moved east, it learned new tongues. Many early texts in the oases were written in Prakrit or in Sanskrit, using the Kharoshthi script. In later centuries, Sogdian and Tocharian hands added glosses and full translations. When the scriptures reached Chinese scribes, the words had to cross another river. Some ideas resisted a straight crossing. Emptiness in Indian thought wore a different face inside Chinese philosophy. Chinese translators often chose terms from Taoist vocabulary to bridge the gap. The results could be powerful and also could cause argument. That is why the best translators were prized like generals. The monk Kumarajiva was brought from Kucha to Chang'an in the early 5th century and made a team that produced Chinese versions of foundational texts that scholars still read. Dharmaraksa in the 3rd century, Paramartha in the 6th, and Xuanzang in the 7th each left a mark on the canon. Their work was not only translation. The best of them wrote introductions and commentaries, trained students, and advised patrons on the correct support for the Sangha. The pilgrims who went the other way have names that still ring in travel books. Faxian left Chang'an in 399, walked across the deserts and high passes to India, visited monasteries in the Ganges plain, and returned by sea to China in 412 with baskets of palm leaf manuscripts and relics. He wrote a plain account that described the food and the rules and the daily life of the monasteries he saw. and his book remains valuable because he noticed even the small things that scholars forget. 2 centuries later, Xuanzang did the journey with more ambition. He slipped out of the Tang realm in 629 without official leave, crossed Gobi and Pamir, reached Kashmir, and then took the long road down to Nalanda, the great seat of learning in Magadha. He studied there for years, mastered logic and grammar, and a full range of doctrine, and then went home by the northern route in 645, with hundreds of texts on the backs of pack animals. The Tang emperor forgave the breach and built him a translation bureau. His record of the western regions lists distances, lists tax customs in each city, lists the number of monasteries and the number of monks and nuns, and records the state of roads and bridges. It reads like a gazetteer, written by a man who knew what a caravan must know. A generation after Xuanzang, the monk Yijing took the sea road to Srivijaya and to the Ganges, and wrote about the learning of Buddhist communities in the islands and in India. Thus the Silk Road was not only an overland path, knowledge moved also by ship, and the ports of the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal became part of the same web. Under the Tang, the meeting ground widened. Chang'an became a city where a traveler from Samarkand could find a temple of his own faith and a workshop that knew his trade. Zoroastrian fire priests served the needs of Sogdian families. Nestorian Christians carved a stone stele in 781 that recorded the arrival of their mission a century before. Buddhist communities included monks from Central Asia who preached in their mother tongues to merchants who still preferred their own language. The state regulated, but mostly tolerated. Monasteries paid taxes in certain periods and were exempted in others. The court could call on monks to pray for rain or for victory, and emperors sometimes debated doctrine with famous teachers. The art of the capital absorbed foreign lines. Musical instruments from farther west entered the orchestras. Wall paintings in caves near Turfan show donors in Sogdian dress and Chinese dress standing beside each other. The spread of the teaching did not stop at the eastern capital. From the Yellow Sea, the message crossed to the peninsula and the islands. In the 4th century, Buddhism reached the kingdoms of Koguryo, Paiche, and Silla. A century later, it crossed to the Japanese court, carried by envoys and monks, and by images and sutras that a king of Peish sent as gifts. In the centuries that followed, Japanese monks sailed to China to study and returned to build schools at home. Thus, a teaching that began under fig trees on the Ganges became part of the lives of peasants and princes in the islands of the Eastern Sea. The road also carried loss. At Bamiyan in the Hindu Kush, craftsmen in the 6th century carved towering Buddhas into a cliff, one taller than 50 meters. Travelers in the medieval period wrote with wonder about them. Long after the main caravans had faded, the statues still watched the valley. In our own time, they were destroyed by men with guns. In the Tarim Basin, languages that once filled monasteries have fallen silent. The Tocharian tongue is no longer spoken. The Sogdian family houses that funded shrines vanished as their descendants became part of other nations. Yet the record remains in murals and in manuscripts. In the library cave at Dunhuang, sealed in the early 11th century and opened by accident in the 19th, there lay tens of thousands of texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, and more. They include receipts, contracts, edicts, and prayers. They show that the life of the road mixed the secular and the sacred until the two could not be told apart. Two inventions quickened the spread. Paper made in China had reached Central Asia by the time of the Tang, and paper-making took root in places like Samarkand. A sheet of paper is cheaper than a sheet of silk and easier to copy. Woodblock printing in China made possible the wide distribution of Buddhist scriptures. The Great Wisdom Sutra and the Lotus Sutra were printed and carried as amulets and as full volumes. A pilgrim could buy a prayer on paper at a temple kiosk for the price of a bowl of noodles and carry it tucked inside a sleeve. In the other direction, Indian and Central Asian medicine and astronomy traveled with the monks and with Muslim scholars who shared the roads. The Silk Road became a school as much as a market. By the end of the 8th century, the tone of the road changed as new rulers took the western half and power shifted in the east. The teaching endured under new banners and in new languages because people had found uses for it. A merchant facing the long march across gravel needed a rule for patience and a prayer for safe arrival. A widow in an oasis town needed a community that would feed her and a chant that would carry her grief. A king ruling a valley needed the prestige of learned men and the soft power of patronage. Buddhism offered all of that and a path that claimed to end sorrow. That is why the bells at Dunhuang rang before dawn, and why a young man in Kashgar could recite verses learned from a Gandharan teacher whose grandfather had carved in the Greek manner. That is why a caravan could arrive at Khotan and find both a tax inspector and a monk waiting at the city gate. The caravans taught a harsh lesson. Goods move fastest when force clears the way. Teachings move fastest when a road already exists for merchants. The Dharma rode the same camels as silk. It slept under the same roofs. It paid the same tolls at the same gates. In return, it gave the road a purpose beyond profit and turned a chain of markets into a map of mines. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the great pillars that had steadied the caravan world began to splinter. In the east, the Han dynasty fell in the year 220, after generations of court intrigue, warlord coalitions, and peasant uprisings that had shaken the grain routes and the imperial arsenals. The empire broke into the 3 kingdoms, Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu along the river and the coast. Later came a brief reunification under Jin, then another long age of division that historians call the era of the northern and southern dynasties. Courts moved between Luoyang, Jiangkang, and Chang'an. Along the northern frontier, steppe confederations pressed inward. The Tuoba clan founded the Northern Wei in the late 4th century, and later split into Eastern Wei and Western Wei. Soldiers and settlers were planted in garrison colonies across the Hexi Corridor to hold the road that linked Gansu to the Tarim Basin. The map changed color many times, but the string of oases from Dunhuang to Kashgar still mattered, because wells and orchards do not move. Far to the west, the Roman world entered its own crisis. In the year 260, Shapur I of the new Sasanian dynasty captured the Roman Emperor Valerian near Edessa and paraded the victory on rock reliefs at Naksh-e-Rustam. The message was plain. The Parthians were gone, and a harder Persian state had taken their place. The Sasanians, whose first king Ardashir rose in 224, centralized power at Ctesiphon and revived the Zoroastrian priesthood. They minted thin silver drachms with fire altars on the reverse and used them to pay cavalry and to settle accounts in the bazaars of Mesopotamia and Iran. They fortified the passes into the Iranian plateau and the great gates at Gurgan and Derbent. They taxed caravans at river crossings and on the old royal roads. In the Roman sphere, the Emperor Constantine founded Constantinople in 330 as a new capital on the Bosporus. The city controlled the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and became a warehouse where Eastern wares met Western coin. When the old Western Empire finally unraveled in 476, the Greek-speaking empire at Constantinople lived on and learned to trade as fiercely as it fought. War flared and cooled and flared again along the frontier between the Sasanians and the Romans, who now called themselves Byzantines. Julian died on campaign in Persia in 363 and left his army to retreat through fire and sand. The Treaty of 387 divided Armenia. Khosrow I invaded Syria in 540 and took Antioch, a city whose colonnaded streets had for centuries funneled silk into the Roman world. The war that ended in 562 brought an uneasy peace and a schedule of payments. A new round began in 572. The last and most ruinous struggle erupted in 602 when Khosrow II struck after a palace revolution in Constantinople. Persian armies overran Syria, captured Jerusalem in 614, and reached Egypt and the shores of the Aegean. In reply, the Emperor Heraclius marched through Armenia into the Persian heartland and shattered Khosrow's field armies near Nineveh in 627. The war ended only in 628, when Khosrow fell to his own nobles. Armies trampled markets. Cities paid ransom. Yet even in these years of burning granaries, caravans sought side roads and secondary passes. Merchants are a stubborn breed. They count routes the way generals count bridges. Between the torn empires and the divided Chinese states stood the Middle Lands. There the Sogdians rose. Their homeland lay between the Zarafshan and Kashkadarya rivers, with Samarkand and Bukhara as proud city-states. Their language became a common tongue of trade from the Oxus to the Yellow River. Their gods were honored in fire temples and in family shrines, and their houses carried painted halls that showed banquets, hunts, and epic scenes. They were not soldiers of empire. They were contractors of movement. In the early 4th century, a packet of letters written by Sogdian merchants was carried along the northern rim of the Tarim to Dunhuang. The messages spoke of lost cargoes, unpaid debts, and the sack of Luoyang in 311 by steppe armies. They show anxiety and practical sense in the same breath. Those letters, later found sealed in a desert watchtower, prove that even when capitals burned, the men who kept the road alive wrote to partners and tried to settle accounts. Sogdian families formed diasporas along the road. A house in Samarkand kept cousins in Kucha, in Turfan, in Dunhuang, and even in the river towns of the Chinese heartland. They built temples for their own rites and soon learned to patronize Buddhist monasteries because those shrines fed caravans and copied contracts as readily as scriptures. They kept agents who could haggle in Sogdian, in Bactrian, in Middle Persian, in Sanskrit, and in the northern Chinese of the border. They favored 2 humped camels for the high passes and bought string leaders who knew where to find winter feed in the lee of a hill. They learned the tariffs at each gate and what gift would soften a suspicious satrap. Their seals are found from the Oxus to the Wei. Their names appear in Chinese records as interpreters and officials because a court that wanted horses and jade needed men who could translate between kings. Power in the Middle Lands shifted like sand. In the 5th century, the Hephthalites, whom later writers called the White Huns, took Bactria, and pressed hard on both Sasanian Persia and the northern Indian kingdoms. They issued coinage that imitated Sasanian designs and stamped their own royal marks upon it. They took tribute in silk and silver and controlled river crossings on the Oxus. Their riders harried Sasanian frontiers until Khosrow I and the rising Turkic Khaganate struck them from opposite sides around the middle of the 6th century and broke their confederation. In that same century, the Gökturk rulers of the steppe forged a new power that stretched from Manchuria to the Caspian. They learned quickly that Sogdian caravans brought wealth more reliably than raids. Turkic rulers used Sogdian scribes, minted coins, and encouraged markets at the edge of their camps. In the year 568, a Sogdian envoy named Mania carried gifts from the western Turkic Khagan to the Byzantine court of Justin II, an embassy that proposed direct silk trade with Constantinople to bypass Persian tolls. Byzantine envoys went back across the steppe to the Khagan's court the next year. The commanders of cavalry and the masters of bales had begun to speak to each other over the heads of old enemies. On the Chinese side of the world, the Northern Wei sponsored horse markets on the frontier and moved their capital to Luoyang to better sit astride river and road. When the dynasty split and fell, the short-lived Northern Qi and Northern Zhou kept the garrisons and the way stations. In the south, the Liang and Chen courts ruled river cities and kept their own merchants occupied with sea routes. The kingdoms that ringed the Tarim Basin watched the balance and adjusted tribute as quickly as weather vanes turn. Shanshan at the edge of the Lop, Nor Marshes, Kucha on the northern rim, Khotan rich in jade on the southern rim, and Karasha on the lake all minted coins, kept their own militias, and welcomed whomever could pay and protect. Their kings sponsored Buddhist translations and fed pilgrim scholars because a monastery made a district safer and drew caravans to spend money in its market. The Sasanians built and maintained systems that merchants could use. They repaired segments of the old royal ways and the smaller roads that linked towns to main arteries. They ran posting stations where a royal rider could change horses and a private traveler could buy a bed and fodder. They guarded the mountain passes into the plateau and the gates that led north onto the steppe. They arranged customs at the bridges near Ctesiphon and Nisibis. Persian silver flowed east in stamped coins that bore the stylized fire altar and attendants. Those coins have been found in Central Asian hoards and in graves along the northern China frontier, often cut and pierced for reuse. In return, the Sasanians took Chinese silk thread and finished cloth and sent it to their own court and to allied nobles, and also sold it on to Byzantine buyers when peace allowed. The Byzantines answered with gold coins, whose weight and purity were so reliable that they were accepted in markets as far as the Indian Ocean ports. War never left the stage, yet merchants turned conflict into opportunity where they could. When Palmyra rose in the 3rd century under Odenathus and his queen Zenobia, the city drew tolls on the desert route and brokered between Persia and Rome until Aurelian took it in 272. When Antioch fell to Khosrow in 540, traders shifted stock to Tyre and to Alexandria and kept the coastal traffic alive. When drought and locusts weakened a district, caravans favored the other rim of the Tarim and waited for a better season. Even raiders could be bargained with. A caravan master of good reputation could sometimes buy advance warning of trouble or purchase passage from a camp outside the walls. The sums were recorded on wax tablets and settled later in silver and silk measured by the bolt. The road carried beliefs along with goods. and the centuries of fracture gave space for many faiths to travel. Zoroastrian priests tended fires in Iranian cities and in Sogdian communities. Manichaean missionaries preached a grand fusion of light and dark, and their books appear in manuscripts from Turfan and Dunhuang. Christian communities of the Church of the East grew under Sasanian rule and organized themselves with a synod at Seleucia Ctesiphon in 410. They wrote in Syriac and sent bishops as far as Merv and Samarkand. Jewish merchants kept networks that tied Mesopotamian academies to caravan towns. Everywhere, monasteries and temples doubled as safe houses and storerooms. Everywhere, scribes copied not only scriptures, but contracts and letters. The library cave at Dunhuang, sealed much later, contains tax receipts, loan notes, and shipping lists that show how sacred and secular shared a desk and a brush. By the close of the 6th century, the outlines of endurance are clear. Empires fell and rose. Banners changed over fortresses. Yet the practical infrastructure of exchange survived because it was profitable to all who controlled a piece of it. Oasis kings maintained wells and orchards. Steppe Kagans learned that a market near a camp brought tin, iron, and wine. Persian and Byzantine courts found that a truce could refill treasuries faster than a year of raids. Chinese rulers of the north and south lined the Hexi corridor with posts and stores, because even a divided realm needed horses and tax revenue. And the Sogdians, tireless and shrewd, kept the ledgers and the routes, and taught others to love the sound of camel bells. China held silk like a dragon holds a pearl. For centuries, the court forbade the export of silkworms and mulberry seed. The penalty for stealing the secret of sericulture was death. Silk did not begin as a merchant's commodity. It began as a state treasure. Yet secrets travel with people, and the road is made of people. One old story places a turning point far inside the desert at Khotan. The kings of that oasis wanted their own silk. A marriage was arranged with a Chinese princess. She was warned by her new hosts that Khotan must learn the craft, and she was warned by her own country that she must not give it. The tale says she hid silkworm eggs in her headdress and mulberry seed in her baggage, and crossed the passes as a bride. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Khotan grew mulberry groves and reeled thread, and for generations the oasis produced silk that moved north to the steppe and west towards Sogdiana. The story has the shape of legend, but the result is plain. By the early centuries of our era, sericulture existed beyond the Chinese heartland, and an oasis that lived by jade and caravans added silk to its wealth. Another theft changed the balance of the Mediterranean. In the reign of Justinian in the 6th century, 2 monks who had lived in the Far East came to Constantinople with a plan. Procopius, who wrote the Wars of the Emperor, says they traveled into the lands of the Seres, learned how silk was bred and fed, and then carried silkworm eggs west, hidden inside their walking staffs of bamboo. They kept the eggs warm with dung and ash, so that they would not spoil. They reached the court on the Bosporus around the year 552. The emperor paid them well and put them to work. Imperial workshops in Constantinople began to rear the worms, boil the cocoons, and reel thread. Soon the court could weave its own brocades. Purple silk, dyed with a royal pigment, and marked as a garment only emperors could grant, came from looms guarded by law. The monopoly was not total, and it did not last forever. It was enough to give Byzantium leverage that earlier emperors had lacked when they bargained with Persia and with cities that sat on desert gates. The knowledge did not stop at the walls of the capital. Weavers in Syria and Phoenicia had long made and dyed luxury cloth, and they took to silk with skill once raw thread was available nearby. In the 7th and 8th centuries, silk weaving spread to Thebes and Corinth and other Greek towns. In Persia, the Sasanians had woven silk from imported thread for centuries. After the 6th century, and more widely after the 7th, sericulture appears in parts of Iran and Transcaucasia, where climate and mulberry would allow it. In Sogdian, towns merchants paid for mulberry orchards as carefully as they paid for camel strings. The strict Chinese monopoly that had held since Han no longer held the world. There was still nothing equal to the best Chinese thread and brocade, which came from regions that had practiced the craft for 1,000 years. But others could make cloth that satisfied rulers nearer to home. Silk smoothed diplomacy as well as profit. The Sasanians sent bolts of figured silk as gifts to steppe rulers and to Arab chiefs. The Byzantines regulated who could buy imperial purple and at what price. The value printed on a bolt could be as carefully calculated as a treaty clause. In the East, Chinese courts offered damasks and gauzes to Wusun and to Turkic Hagans to buy peace and horses. In the Middle Lands, local kings and merchant houses learned to stamp contracts that pledged future deliveries of a set number of bolts at set weights and widths. The vocabulary of the market grew precise. A road that once moved rumor now moved standards. While silk was changing hands, the faiths of the borderlands were changing hearts. For centuries, the middle of Eurasia had held a tangle of temples and gods. Zoroastrian fire burned in Persian homes and in Sogdian shrines. Buddhist communities tended caves and halls along the Tarim Basin and beyond. Manichaean missionaries carried books that spoke of light and dark, and argued with both Zoroastrian priests and Buddhist abbots. Christian bishops of the Church of the East wrote in Syriac and held synods at Seleucia Ctesiphon and sent clergy to Merv and Samarkand. The caravan towns were used to many prayers spoken under one roof. Then a new voice rose from Arabia. In the year 610, the Prophet Muhammad began to preach in Mecca that there is one God and that the idols are nothing. In 622, he moved with his followers to Medina. In 630, Mecca accepted the new faith. Within a decade of his death, in 632 armies from Arabia were riding north and east with a discipline that stunned older empires. At the river Yarmouk, in 636, a Byzantine field army broke before the Arab cavalry and the spears and shields of the desert tribes. In the same year, another army fought at Al-Qadisiyah and opened the road to the Persian capital. Ctesiphon fell in 637. The old Sasanian court fled east and tried to rally. At Nihawand in 642, the last organized Persian field army was destroyed. Yazdegerd III died in 651 in distant lands, and the Sasanian royal line ended. The new rulers set their seat at Kufa and then at Damascus under the Umayyad house. Their administration kept what worked. They used the Persian diwan to pay troops and assess taxes. They kept canal inspectors and market inspectors. They placed Arab garrisons in the old Sasanian cities of Khurasan and made Merv a base for further campaigns. They struck coins at first that copied Sasanian types with fire altars and royal busts and with short Arabic phrases added. In the reign of Abd al-Malik near the end of the 7th century, the coinage was reformed into pure epigraphic designs. Gold dinars and silver dirhams carried the testimony of faith and the names of mints. We can list mints on the caravan belt from Wasset and Kufa to Merv and Balkh and farther north once the frontier moved. A merchant in Bukhara could hold a coin and know where it had been struck and under which governor, and he could weigh it and know what it would buy. In the early 8th century, the armies of the Caliphate crossed the Oxus. The general Qutayba ibn Muslim served under the governors of Khorasan and pushed through Transoxiana season by season. Bukhara fell in 709 after hard fighting and bargaining with local rulers. Samarkand opened in 712. Khwarazm, near the Aral waters, was taken in the same campaign. The mosques came, the tax registers were rewritten, and Arab settlers and soldiers married into local families. The change in faith was not instant. Zoroastrian fires still burned. Buddhist shrines still held learned men. Christian communities kept their bishops. The process of conversion took generations. Some Sogdians became Muslims quickly for the trade advantages and the new legal protections that came with joining the community of believers. Others held to older rites for a long time. By the 9th century, Islam had become the main faith in the great towns of Transoxiana, and the Friday prayer gathered the men of the markets and the craft guilds. Language and law traveled with belief. Arabic spread as the language of government and of learned men. Contracts could be written in Sogdian or Persian when both parties preferred it, but the courts that sat under the new rulers understood Arabic formulas best. Commercial practice borrowed new tools. Large partnerships and credit instruments, such as the suftaja and the sak, made it easier to move value without moving coin. A trader from Fustat could write a note that another banker would honor in Basra or in Merv, and caravans could carry goods rather than heavy silver. Inns and forts that guarded trade took on new forms. The Ribat began as a frontier post to house Ghazi soldiers, and soon also served as a hostel for travelers and a market seed that could grow into a town. The road did not lose its older habits. Silk still crossed the gates. Paper, which had taken root in Central Asia by the 8th century, began to be made in Samarkand, and then in other cities. That story belongs to a later battle on a river called Talas and to the age of the Abbasid caliphs. For now, it is enough to see that a new ruling world had taken the western half of the road, and that its laws and tastes shaped the traffic. Merchants who once paid tolls to a Persian satrap now paid them to an Arab qadi and a tax farmer who kept his books in Arabic and Persian. The coins in a counting tray might carry a cross in one place and a fire altar in another in the early years. By the time a grandson took over the stall, those same trays held discs marked with the testimony of faith and the date in the calendar of the Hijra. In Central Asia, the skyline changed slowly. A Zoroastrian fire temple might become a mosque courtyard. A Buddhist hall might be emptied and reused as a store. An Nestorian church might survive in a lane near the weavers and the dye vats. The markets grew as rich as ever. The new rulers valued caravans and learned the same lesson as kings before them. A road feeds a city, and a city pays a treasury. Samarkand repaired its walls and filled its bazaars. Bukhara drew scholars and jurists. Merv became a city of gardens and canals whose fruit sellers were praised by travelers. The faith of Islam encouraged contracts and charity, and endowments funded schools and hostels that sat beside the yards where camels were shod. By the middle of the 8th century, two worlds touched along the spine of the Tian Shan. To the east, the Tang court held protectorates among the oases and posted Chinese garrisons in the old kingdoms of the Tarim. To the west, The Umayyads were giving way to the Abbasids, who would soon make Baghdad a capital of learning and trade. Between them lay the upper waters of the Jaxartes and Chu, and the old steppe paths. It was there in the year 751 that two armies would meet at the river Talas. The result would fix a frontier and help carry one more Chinese craft into the markets of the Caliphate. When the Sui fell and the great canal still glittered like a sword across the plains, a new house took the throne and made the old roads busy again. The Tang rose in the year 618. They set their capital at Chang'an, where the Wei and Jing rivers meet, and where the grid of avenues could swallow whole caravans without a ripple. The court of Emperor Taizong and his son Gaozong fought in long lines and lived by the timetable of the relay post. Their officials measured distance in stages and built policy out of milestones and sealed orders that could cross 1,000 li in a week. First, they secured the hinge of the world. The Hexi corridor was studded with garrisons and storehouses and watchtowers that signaled by smoke and fire. From Dunhuang, the road forked into the northern and southern rims of the Tarim Basin. In 640, the Tang army broke Gaochang near Turfan and planted the protectorate of Angshi to pacify the west. Within a decade, the four garrisons at Kucha, Karashar, Kashgar, and Khotan stood like stakes along the oases. The Baiting protectorate at Tingzhou in the northern Tian Shan followed to anchor the upper routes. Generals such as Su Dingfang and later Gao Xianzi marched as far as the valleys of Fergana and beyond. They broke or bargained with steppe khagans, gave titles to caravan kings, and posted Chinese commanders in cities whose markets sold Sogdian felt and Khotanese jade beside Sichuan silks. The settlement of empire needed more than soldiers. It needed a tax roll and a harvest that a treasurer could count. The Tang kept the equal field registers that had been rebuilt under the Sui and refined the household tax so that grain, cloth, and labor could be called in with some regular rhythm. They minted the Kaiyuan Tongbao in 621, a neat round coin with a square hole that would ring in purses from the Yangtze to the frontier posts for 3 centuries. They kept the Grand Canal clear so that rice from the south could feed the armies in the north and the merchants in the capital. A grain junk on the canal could carry more food than a caravan and could make the difference between a lean garrison and a strong one when winter storms closed the mountain passes. While garrisons held the gates, Chang'an became a theater of the world. The city was laid out as a strict grid, with palace wards, ministerial compounds, and 2 great government-supervised markets that opened and closed by bell. In the West Market, a traveler could walk among stalls of Sogdian traders who sold silverwork with animal scrolls, Persian merchants who brought glass cups from the Levant, and Indian dealers who offered spices and fragrant woods. Chinese brokers stacked bolts of silk and hemp next to new luxuries that the age itself had made famous. Tea from the misty hills of the south rose from village drink to court ritual. Paper was made in government mills and private yards in many provinces. Wood blocks, carved with characters, turned ink and fiber into books that could travel in the sleeve of a clerk. In the far desert, a printer would one day press the Diamond Sutra in the year 868 and bind it as a scroll that still speaks of its donor and the hope of merit. The court welcomed many faiths and watched them with a steady eye. Buddhism had been in China for centuries. Under the Tang, it shaped law codes, poetry, and the calendar of festivals. In 645, the monk Xuanzang came home from Nalanda with hundreds of manuscripts and an education that warmed the emperor's pride. He set up a translation bureau in Chang'an and turned Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese with a team of scholars who argued about each term until the master agreed to a phrase that would hold. Zoroastrian fire altars burned for Sogdian clans. Manichaean teachers spoke of light and darkness. In 781, Nestorian Christians carved a tall stone in the capital that praised the first mission which had arrived a century earlier. The city had lanes where the elders of foreign communities kept their own law for marriage and inheritance. It had wards where music from Kucha and dances from Samarkand delighted audiences who had learned to love foreign rhythms. The pipa and the oboe entered Chinese orchestras. Riders from Fergana showed off at the polo fields. Court paintings wore step boots and floral brocades in their scenes of banquets and hunt. Trade under this roof moved with a confidence that had no equal in earlier ages. Silk in many grades and weaves went west by camel to the protectorates and then to the markets of Transoxiana and Persia. Porcelain from kilns in Hebei and Henan and the celadons of the south traveled in padded crates. Sankai ware with copper green and iron amber glazes pleased nobles and foreign envoys alike. Fine paper and inkstones moved not as luxury but as tools of rule and learning. In return came horses from the Ili and Fergana valleys, frankincense and myrrh through Persian hands, lapis and turquoise, silver from the mines of the Iranian plateau, and glassware from Syrian furnaces. The traffic ran also by sea. The port of Guangzhou saw ships from Srivijaya, from India, and from the Arab world. Customs officials there kept registers in careful hands and wrote the origin of each cargo and the duties due. Many foreign merchants chose to winter in the south and ride north in spring with an imperial convoy for safety. The world's goods found it useful to travel under Tang's seals. The system that made this possible relied on routine. Relay stations on the great roads kept fresh horses and fodder. Waybills traveled with official cargo. Granaries at border prefectures stored millet and wheat for emergencies. A network of courier offices moved sealed packets from the ministries to the frontier generals without pause. In the oases, the Protector General of Anxi balanced tribute, salaries for local troops, and the costs of repairing wells and caravan walls. Chinese law and local custom met on paper in bilingual orders that listed the dates and the obligations of each party. When a trouble rose, the court had a habit of answering with both horse and letter. It could send a prince with gifts to soothe a Kagan 1 month, and a column of infantry to replace a garrison the next. The road also brought knowledge in both directions. Chinese workshops learned glass recipes from Western technicians, motifs of vine scrolls, winged horses, and pearl roundels entered Tang textiles and wall paintings. Central Asian craftspeople took Chinese tastes home. Paper making moved firmly west along the routes that Tang patrols had kept open. Astronomers from Persia worked at the observatory in the capital and compared star tables with Chinese scholars. Doctors traded materia medica, words crossed as well. Many Sogdian and Turkic terms for music, dance, and trade entered the language of the marketplace. Many Chinese terms for administration and coinage entered the documents of the oases. It could not last without strain. To the south and west, the Tibetan Empire surged across the highlands in the 7th and 8th centuries and wrestled with Tang garrisons for control of the Tarim. Cities like Khotan and Kashgar changed hands more than once. The Turks, on the steppe, split, rose, and split again, and their favor had to be courted. Yet until the middle of the 8th century, Tang authority along the road remained credible. The same general who mapped the western valleys for Chang'an led an army to a river called Talas in the year 751. Gao Xianzhi faced the forces of the Abbasid Caliphate and their allies. The defeat there ended Tang expansion in Central Asia and loosened the grip on the protectorates. 4 years later, the rebellion of Anlushan tore the heart out of the empire. Frontier troops recalled to the east left gaps that the Tibetans and local powers quickly filled. Chang'an itself was sacked in 763 by Tibetan forces during the Long Chaos. The court survived, but the door that had been held open by policy and spear began to swing back toward China. Even so, the years of strength left a deep mark. The pattern of garrisons and markets across the deserts, the habit of welcoming foreign merchants to a capital that could absorb them, the arts that had learned to celebrate both local forms and distant lines, all of this outlived the moment of military reach. The Silk Road under the Tang was not only a path for bales, it was a school for rulers who learned that a post road and a customs house could make a province safe. It was a habit learned by city dwellers who discovered that a foreign lane could be a neighbor rather than a threat. It was a memory of a time when a man from Samarkand could sell a saddle in Chang'an before noon and hear a sermon in his own tongue by sunset. The road that the Tang had held with spears now ran into a world ordered by new rulers and a single book. In the 8th century, the Umayyad house gave way to the Abbasids, and in the year 762 the second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, founded a round city on the Tigris and named it Baghdad. From this new capital, the caliphs drew lines of command to Khorasan in the east and to Egypt and the Maghrib in the west, and they bound those lines with coinage, tax registers, and a law that merchants could trust. A caravan that left Bukhara with bales of raw silk and paper could reach the emporia of Iraq under the same confession of faith, and with judges who read the same legal formulas. The old patchwork of tolls and feuds did not vanish, but a single political canopy covered more of the western half of the road than any power since Rome. The victory that fixed the frontier with China came at a river beyond the Tian Shan. In the year 751, the Tang general Gao Shanji marched into the valleys of the Chu and Talas. There he met an army raised by the Abbasid governors of Transoxiana, with Turkic allies watching the wind. The Chinese line broke after the Karluk horsemen turned, and the survivors withdrew toward the east. The defeat did not bring Arab banners to Dunhuang, but it ended the expansion of Tang power in Central Asia and gave the caliphate undisputed influence from the Oxus to the Sia Daria. Later, storytellers said that Chinese prisoners skilled in making paper were taken to Samarkand and taught the craft to local workmen. Whether the skill came by that single capture or by slow migration. By the late 8th century, paper was made in Samarkand, and in the year 794 a mill worked in Baghdad. The change is easy to see in the archives of the age. A bureaucracy that had written on parchment and papyrus began to write on a tough sheet beaten from rags and bast, and the price of books fell enough that scholars could think of copying whole libraries. The caliphs of the early Abbasid house made Baghdad into a counting room for the world and into a school. Under al-Rashid and al-Ma'mun, the tax rolls and the post riders of the Barid reached deep into Khorasan and Transoxiana. The mint struck gold dinars, silver dirhams, and copper fulus with mint names and dates and Quranic phrases. A merchant in Merv or Nishapur could weigh a dirham on a steelyard and know its value without argument. The courts of the Qadis used partnership contracts that divided profit between investor and traveling partner. In Arabic, they called this form qirad, or mudaraba. They honored letters of exchange that moved value from one city to another without moving bags of coin. They wrote orders called suftaja for a payment at a distant office, and they drew checks called sak that could be cashed by the bearer. The mutasib, the market inspector, walked the bazaars with assistants to test weights and measures, to keep bakers honest about the size of a loaf, and to find a dyer whose indigo ran in the wash. The law was religion written in everyday words, and enforced by men who knew both scripture and the habits of shopkeepers. A caravan master learned its terms as carefully as he learned the taste of the wells between Merv and Balkh. Cities on the eastern marches flowered because the road paid for them. Merv stood in a plain of canals and orchards, and became a city of 100 trades. Nishapur, set under the Kopet Dag, filled with potters and metal workers and scribes who copied contracts and poetry on the same benches. Bukhara came to rule Transoxiana under the Samanids, a Persian house that held the caliph's writ in the late 9th and 10th centuries. The Samanid mint at Bukhara and at Samarkand struck millions of neat silver dirhams that traveled not only along the road but also by the river routes to the north. In the graves of Scandinavia and in hoards buried by the Volga, you can still find strings of Samanid dirhams with holes drilled in them, proof that the fur and slave trade of the Rus joined the same silver current that paid for silk and paper in the south. Rai near the Alborz, Isfahan on the Zayandeh River, and Herat on the Hari were also fed by the road. The names of their markets appear again and again in the itineraries that geographers wrote for officials and pilgrims. Security for this traffic came from a web of strong places built a day's journey apart. In Persian and Arabic, a fortified inn could be called a khan or a funduk. On frontiers, a military hospice called a ribat housed fighting men, and in quieter times, offered a square court, stables, and a kitchen to travelers. In the Iranian plateau and in Transoxiana, the interval between such shelters often matched what a string of camels could cover in a day, around 30 to 40 kilometers, and along dangerous stretches the distances could be shorter. Gatehouses were heavy with wood and iron, and walls were thick enough to make archers of the garrison comfortable against raiders. The government endowed some of these places from tax revenue or private pious foundations that Islamic law called waqf. Others were built by merchant guilds and city notables who understood that a safe road protects a fortune. A caravan arrived near sundown, paid a small fee for the pen that would hold its beasts, and bargained for fodder, lamps, and a corner to spread blankets. In the morning, the master stamped the tallies in his notebook, settled with the keeper, and took the road again. The knowledge that ran with the caravans made Baghdad and the eastern cities shine. The House of Wisdom gathered translators who turned the astronomy and medicine of the Greeks and the mathematics of India into Arabic. Al-Khwarizmi worked at court early in the 9th century and wrote on algebra and on geography. His tables and his world map pulled information from travelers and from scholars in Syria and Iran and India. Ibn Khordad Bey, a postal official, wrote a book of routes and realms in the same century that listed stages and distances and named the peoples who carried trade, including Jewish merchants who traveled from Spain to China and were called the Radhanites by Arabic writers. Later, geographers such as al-Istakhri and al-Muqaddasi described the markets and strengths of each province from Fars to Khorasan, and their pages often read like a manual for a caravan master. The line of learning did not end in Baghdad. In Bukhara and Nishapur, scholars wrote hadith collections and law books. In Samarkand, astronomers took star sightings on flat roofs in the cool of night. The common tool for all this work was paper, thick and brown in the Samarkand style, whiter and smoother in the Baghdad style, cut in sizes that scribes and binders recognized by name. The exchange of goods under the crescent ran in both directions and across many classes. From China and the Far East came silk in skeins and woven cloth, porcelain and stoneware packed in straw, paper and ink, and medicinal aromatics. From the steppes and Siberian forests came furs and wax. From India came pepper, sandalwood and cottons. From the Iranian plateau came silver, steel, and textiles that carried pearl roundel patterns, favored in court robes. From Syria came colored glass and fine inlays. The traders of Basra and Siraf mixed sea and land. They shipped cargo to the Malabar coast, to Sri Lanka, and to the Straits, then turned part of that flow inland through Fars and Khuzestan to reach the Tigris markets. In the other direction, caravans carried copper from Oman and indigo from the Indus Valley across the Zagros to the cities of Khorasan. A broker in Baghdad could write a contract that bound a partner in Samarkand to deliver a set number of bolts by a named month, and would secure that promise with a lien on a house near the bazaar. That is how confidence becomes a road. Religion ordered this economy without smothering it. Non-Muslim subjects who kept the law were protected as people of the book and paid specific taxes. Many remained active as merchants, translators, and craftsmen. Sogdian families converted over generations and kept their skills. Persian became the language of poetry and high administration in the East, even while Arabic remained the language of law and faith. Court culture in Bukhara and Ghazni later gave hospitality to poets and scholars who wrote in Persian about kingship and love, while their chancelleries recorded customs, dues, and caravan schedules in neat Arabic hands. The blend produced a civil life that could count and pray at the same time. Even strong systems meet storms. The 9th century saw civil wars in Iraq and the rise and fall of the Barmakid ministers who had favored scholars and builders. The 10th century saw the Dalamite Buyids seize Baghdad and rule in the caliph's name, while the Samanids held the east. None of this ended the road. The dirham remained a known weight. The caravanserai doors still opened at dusk. The mint masters kept the dyes working at Ray and Isfahan. When power shifted, merchants paid the new tolls and kept their books. By the 11th century, Turks who had once hired on as guards stood as rulers. The Seljuks took Khorasan, entered Baghdad in the year 1055, and issued their own edicts to protect markets and postal routes. They built new khans across Iran and Anatolia. Large stone lodges with water pools in the courts and prayer rooms in the corners. A string of them from Hamadan to Tabriz, and across to the plateau of Rum, shows in its very spacing the march of a caravan. What the caliphal centuries accomplished was a leveling of risk and a widening of reach. A merchant born in Balkh could marry into a house in Bukhara, hold a share in a partnership that shipped pepper from Gujarat, invest in a dye shop in Nishapur, and endow a school near his mosque. He could send his son with a letter of exchange to cash at Wasit and travel north through Mosul to buy Syrian glass to carry home. He would meet officials who understood the stamps on his papers. He would sleep under roofs built for men like him. He would weigh his coins against iron weights marked by the market inspector. He would hear a sermon on Friday that praised fair dealing and charity, and warned him not to cheat in the measure. His world was large and comprehensible, and it flowed along the same roads that had seen Sogdian letters and Roman glass in earlier centuries. The light would tilt again in time. New powers would come out of the steppe with a speed that no tax register could reckon. They would burn some of these cities and then rebuild them as their own capitals. They would bring their own relay posts and their own passports, and a peace so broad that a trader from Genoa could talk to a camel man from the Yellow River at a tea stall in Tabriz. Before that arrival, the age under the crescent had already shown how much a common law and a shared currency can quicken a continent. On the high grass between the Onon and the Kurlan, a boy learned to live by snares and by the edge of a flint knife. He was called Temujin. He was born into the Borjigin clan in the middle of the 12th century, when the tribes of the eastern steppe hunted and raided and swore oaths that rarely held past a winter. His father, Yesugei, was poisoned by rivals when the boy was still small. His family was cast out and left to survive on fish, marmot, and patience. In that hard school, Temujin learned the weight of loyalty and the hatred of betrayal. He made allies among clans that had been enemies and kept his word longer than others dared. He took back his wife Berte when she was seized by the Merkits, and he paid the Kerate ruler Togrul with service and gifts until the old man turned against him out of fear. Temujin answered with war. He drew the Naimans and the Kerates and the Taichiuds into his net, broke them piece by piece, took captives for his growing army, and promoted men for talent rather than ancestry. In the spring of 1206, the princes and captains of the steppe met at a great council on the banks of the Onon. They lifted Temujin on a felt carpet and named him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. He set his realm in order before he set it in motion. The tribes were broken and remade as a single people. He organized the army by tens and hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands. The smallest unit was an arban of 10. 10 arbans made a jaghun. 10 jaghuns made a mingan. 10 mingans made a tumen of 10,000. Each man knew his officer, and each officer knew that rank was earned on campaign, not inherited in a tent. He issued the great law called the Yasa to curb the worst habits of the raiders and to bind his people to a single discipline. Theft was punished, feuds were restrained, spies and scouts were paid in honor as well as in cattle. He raised a guard from many clans so that his person would not be hostage to one blood. He summoned the Uyghur scribe Tata Tonga from the west and adopted the Uyghur script to record orders and ledgers. He took the best bows and saddles and stirrups the tribes could make and set craftsmen to improve them. He rewarded merchants who dared to travel with his army, and he took their counsel about routes and fodder. He understood that war is logistics and that horses must eat before men can conquer. Then he rode. The western Xiar of the Ordos bent the knee in 1209 and 1210 after the Mongol Tumans crossed the Yellow River and showed that their arrows could reach beyond the horizon. In 1211, he turned against the Jin dynasty that held North China. He sent Mukhali to grind down the border prefectures while he himself struck at the field armies. The Mongols used feigned flight to draw heavy cavalry into traps, and they learned to sit out sieges when a city would not be pulled into the open. They hired Chinese engineers and took their traction trebuchets into service. In 1215, the Jin capital of Zhongdu, which we call Beijing, fell to fire and hammer after a long encirclement. The palaces burned and the markets were looted, and the new masters took from the libraries what they could use. The Jin court fled south to Kaifeng and held on for years, but the north was no longer theirs. He did not stop at the Great Wall. In 1216 and 1217, his generals ranged across the steppe to break pockets of resistance and to pull the tribes into the new order. Subutai and Jebe, two of his finest captains, learned to ride far on little bread and to speak in the tongues of their enemies. With the east and the north secured, Genghis Khan turned his eyes to the west, where a chain of cities guarded the crossings of the Oxus and the Sir Daria, and where caravans weighed profit under almond trees. Between 1219 and 1221, a quarrel with the Khwarezmian Empire became a storm. A caravan from the Mongol realm had been seized, and its men killed at Otrar by a governor who feared spies more than he cared for law. The Khan demanded justice. The Shah dismissed the demand and killed the envoys. That choice opened the gates of Asia. The empire did not split with him. The princes met in council and chose Ögedei as the next great Khan in 1229. Under his hand, the conquests resumed with a wider horizon. In the north of China, the Jin were crushed in 1234 by the joint pressure of Mongol armies and the southern Song. In the west, the Mongol banners moved beyond the Volga. From 1236 to 1242, Batu, a son of Jochi, and Subutai, led a long campaign that broke the Volga Bulgars, burned Ryazan and Vladimir, took Kiev in 1240, crossed the Carpathians, defeated the army of Hungary at the river Saho near Mohi in 1241, and shattered a coalition of princes at Legnica in Poland in the same spring. The death of Ögedei called the captains back to the steppe for the next election and spared Western Europe a second season. On the Iranian plateau and in Mesopotamia, the line of conquest was taken up by Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis. He broke the Nizari strongholds in the Alborz, took Baghdad in 1258, and ended the line of Abbasid caliphs with the death of al-Mustasim/Nosta. A city that had been a lamp of learning and trade since the 8th century was handed over to soldiers and to fire for days. In Syria, the advance met its first clear check when the Mamluk army of Egypt beat a Mongol host at Ain Jalut in 1260. Even a whirlwind can be turned by a mountain pass and a steady hand. What the whirlwind left behind was not only ash. It also left a single political roof over most of the road. The realm of Genghis and his heirs was divided among the houses of Jochi, Chagatai, Tolui, and Ögedei. But the custom of the family kept the lines of travel open when policy allowed. The Golden Horde took the steppe from the Irtish to the Dnieper. The Chagatai Khans held the central belt of Transoxiana and the Tian Shan valleys. In Iran and Iraq, the Ilkhans ruled from Tabriz and then from Sultaniye. In the east, Kublai, grandson of Genghis, finished the conquest of the southern Song, proclaimed the Yuan in 1271, took Linan in 1276, and won the final naval battle at Yarman in 1279. Karakorum in Mongolia had been marked as a camp and then a town early in the reign of Ögedei, with workshops and a palace for councils, and a tree of silver made by a captive artisan that poured wine at feasts. Under Kublai, the court shifted to Khanbalik in the North China Plain. Between these capitals and the lesser seats of the other houses ran the lines of a relay post system that Mongols called the Yam. Fresh horses and guards stood at stations a day's ride apart. Bronze tablets called paisa identified envoys and merchants under protection. Official orders moved with the speed of riders who did not spare a mount. A man could travel from the Amu Darya to the Liao with a pouch that would open doors and granaries. The army remained the core of power. The Tumen still rode light and far, and they now brought with them siege engineers from China and from the lands of Islam. Counterweight trebuchets that Persian and Chinese craftsmen improved brought down thick walls. Firepots and early gunpowder bombs that Chinese artisans had first used on southern rivers burst among defenders on ramparts in the west. The Mongols forced cities to surrender by maneuver and by terror. They moved populations as resources. Weavers, potters, metalworkers, doctors, and astrologers were taken to new homes, where their skills could be used by Khans who loved silk robes and fine bowls as much as any settled prince. Yelu Chukai, a Khitan statesman in Mongol service, urged taxation over slaughter in North China and set up household registers so that a conquered land would feed the conquerors. Merchants were bound to the court in partnerships called autok. They received loans from the treasury to buy and move goods and repaid the state with profit and with information. In return, they gained legal protection and a rank that earlier dynasties had denied them. The market learned to work under a warrior government. The Mongol whirlwind broke walls that had stood for centuries and stitched together markets that had only been linked by thin threads. Routes that had been perilous became strong roads, patrolled by riders who feared the wrath of a great Khan more than the pride of a local lord. A trader could carry brocade from Hangzhou to Tabriz and know that his paisa would be honored at relay stations along the way. An Italian from Venice could ride to Karakorum with a bale of glass or a book of accounts and find a seat at a table where a Uyghur scribe and a Persian astronomer were already arguing about calendars. The price of this security had been paid in burned towns and dead fields. Even so, the result was a reach that had never before existed on land. After the storm came the strange quiet of order. Under the airs of Genghis, the steppe courts stitched a single canopy from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea and kept it in place with riders, seals, and fear. The Yam postal road ran like a cord across the land. Relay stations stood a day apart, often 30 to 40 kilometers, with fodder, fresh mounts, and guards who knew that a missed packet could cost a head. Bronze tablets called paisa hung at the belt of envoys and merchant partners and opened storehouses and city gates. A man with such a pass could cross borders as if they were painted lines. Safety bred reach. The great Khans issued Jalik orders that promised protection to caravans that paid their due. Bandits learned to fear the sudden arrival of a patrol. Merchants learned that a pledge written at Tabriz or Bukhara would be honored in Khanbalik if it bore the right seal. The court bound capital to courage through the autok partnerships, lending treasure to trusted houses who moved silk, furs, and spices across deserts and passes, and repaid the treasury with profit and with news. Chinese engineers traveled with Mongol hosts. Persian and Syrian siege masters served in Chinese wars. The empire moved craftsmen as it moved grain, and the road began to sound like a market that never closed. Travelers from many worlds proved the road by walking it. The Franciscan John of Plano Carpini rode from the court of the Pope to the camp at Karakorum in the 1740s of the last millennium, and wrote what he saw with the dry eye of a church lawyer. William of Rubruck went a few years later and described debates on faith before princes who enjoyed argument as sport. Rabban Bar Sauma, a monk from the east who had served in the Ilkhan court, made the reverse journey in the 1280s, and stood in Rome and Paris and Bordeaux as an envoy, an Eastern Christian in a world of Latin kings. Venetian traders and notaries appeared in the ports and the inland fairs, and learned names that had once seemed only rumor. Marco Polo's account of Kublai's court and of the paper money of Yuan China is filled with wonder, but beneath the wonder one hears the clear click of routine. That routine changed the way value moved. In the East, the Yuan court ordered paper currency and required taxes to be paid in it. Foreigners exchanged silver and gold for notes at official offices and spent those notes in markets that trusted the emperor's stamp. In the West, Muslim and Persianate cities wrote partnership contracts and letters of exchange that let a man ship silk instead of coin. Counting rooms in Tabriz and Sultaniya checked weights against iron standards and entered numbers in books that were audited by men who answered to the vizier. The same caravan might carry Chinese porcelain glazed with cobalt that had come from Persian mines, and Persian textiles, decorated with pearl roundels, that had traveled east as court gifts, and then west again as trade goods. Knowledge crossed with goods. In Iran, the Ilkhan Hulegu built an observatory at Maraga and placed the scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi at its head. Astronomers there made star tables that drew on Greek, Indian, and Persian methods, and wrote models that later readers in distant lands would study. In China, the Yuan court employed Persian astronomers and calendar makers in the capital's observatory. Recipes and devices traveled with craftsmen. Chinese saltpeter-rich powders and fire lances became part of siegecraft in the lands of Islam, and in time entered European arsenals. At Xiangyang, Muslim engineers brought counterweight machines that hurled stones with a force new to Chinese walls, while Chinese artisans taught their hosts new ways to cast and to mix. Printing and paper were no longer curiosities in the west of Asia. By the late 13th century, paper mills worked from Samarkand to Baghdad and on into Syria and Egypt, and the price of books fell enough that scholars could copy more than commentaries. Art and taste learned each other's language. Cobalt from the Iranian plateau colored blue and white porcelain in Yuan kilns. Lotus and peony scrolled across bowls that would astonish diners in Cairo as much as in Hangzhou. In the Ilkhanid ateliers, painters borrowed cloud bands and rock forms from Chinese albums and set them behind kings in Persian epics. Foods traveled with seed and habit. Citrus and melons and grapes found new fields. Rice cultivation spread to districts that had the water and the will to terrace hillsides. Even the stable smell of a caravan changed as pepper and cloves mixed with the leather of saddles and the tar of cart wheels. Cities at the crossings became encyclopedias in stone. Tabriz was a warehouse for India and China and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and it kept brokers who could price all four. Seraiki and Persian and Turkic bargained in the same lane. Sultaniya, the new Ilkhan capital on the road between Rai and Tabriz, rose with domes that called distant travelers by pride alone. In the east, Khanbalik was a planned grid where districts were assigned to foreign merchants and where the court's paper orders moved faster than rumors. On the northern shore of the Black Sea, the port of Kaffa rang with Italian tongues and with the voices of steppe traders who had come from the lower Volga, and its quays stitched the sea lanes to the land road. The proverb of the time said that a maiden could carry a nugget of gold on her head from one end of the realm to the other and come to no harm. It was a boast, and also a measure of the fear that held the peace. For a lifetime, and a little more, the caravan master could plan by calendar rather than by omen. He could buy a paisa, hire a scribe to copy his accounts in 2 scripts, and expect to see the same flags at the next gate that he had seen at the last. The first hints came from the roof of the world, where caravans paused in the thin air to water their animals and count their losses. Around the lake of Issyk-Kul, in the late 1330s, funerary stones recorded sudden deaths among a small Christian community. The dates carved as 1338 and 1339, a whisper from the mountains that something unseen had moved into the camps. Hunters on the high steppes spoke of sick marmots that died outside their burrows. Traders on the lower Volga told of fevers that emptied villages along the reed beds. No one yet gave the visitor a single name. The road still rang with bells, and the yam still passed riders from post to post. But the seeds were in the sacks. The shape of what followed can be traced by the markets that fell silent. In the year 1346, the Golden Horde besieged the Genoese port at Kaffa on the Crimean shore. A chronicler said that bodies from the besiegers were flung into the town by engines, and that sailors who fled with the wind carried death into the sea lanes. However, the sickness reached the quays. The result is not in doubt. By autumn of 1347, ships out of the east brought it to Messina and to Genoa and to Venice. Within a winter it was in Pisa and Marseille and Barcelona, and then in Toulouse and Paris and London. In the space of 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, about a third of Europe died, and in some towns the share was nearer to 1/2. Bells tolled without pause, and wills were drawn in haste. Jewish communities were blamed in many places and massacred. a fresh evil laid upon a time already heavy with grief. The same wave was moving through the lands that had lived on the Silk Road. Constantinople suffered in 1347 and 1348, and again thereafter. Alexandria felt the first blow in 1347 and 1348, and Cairo in the next year. The historian al-Makrizi wrote of empty streets and food left unbought. Ibn Battuta crossed Syria during an outbreak in 1348 and counted funerals in the great mosque of Damascus, while judges and merchants prayed for an end. In the Iranian plateau, the plague passed from Tabriz and Sultaniya to Rai and Isfahan, and then across Khorasan. In Transoxiana, the bazaars of Samarkand and Bukhara were thinned. The caravan master, who once measured risk by weather and tolls, now counted which towns still had living guards on their walls. China did not escape. Yuan chronicles speak of terrible epidemics that struck in the 1330s and 1340s, with river valleys losing whole villages and granaries opened without enough hands to carry the grain. Floods and failed harvests added their share of famine. Bandit bands gathered where magistrates could no longer pay soldiers. The Red Turban Risings began in the early 1350s, and by 1368 the Yuan rule in the north had given way to the Ming. In the west, the Ilkhanate had already unraveled after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, leaving Jalayirids and Chobanids and other warlords to dispute the roads of Iraq and Iran. The Golden Horde fractured after Berdi Beg died in 1359, and princes with short reigns sold offices and favors to buy soldiers. The Chagatai realm split between Moghulistan in the east and Transoxiana in the west. A system that had depended on one canopy of fear and law broke into parts, just as the sickness demanded a single firm hand. Trade relies on routine more than it relies on courage. The plague shattered routine. Caravanserais that had been endowed as pious works saw their incomes vanish because tenants died and orchards could not be pruned. Inns stood open with no keeper to sell fodder and no groom to lead animals to the trough. Wells silted without men to clear them. The Yam Post Road could not be kept at full strength when garrisons were short of riders and farriers, and when granaries could not be refilled at the old schedule. Accounts from tax offices grow thin in these years. Coin hoards in many districts cease to be buried because there are fewer profits to hide and fewer men to plan a return journey. The human map shifted. Peasants in river oases abandoned fields and walked to safer ground. Craftsmen who survived left plague-touched towns for places where the gates were still guarded and where the markets still opened at dawn. In the steppe camps, whole herds went untended when the fever reached the tents. In some districts, wolves and dogs grew bold on the edges of walls because the old rhythms of watch and chase had paused. Amid this unraveling came new war. In 1370, a Turkic commander named Timur seized Samarkand and began to assemble a realm where his word could make a caravan safe again. He restored canals and planted gardens and invited scholars to return. He also rode with armies that scoured cities to the foundation. He sacked Delhi in 1398 and Damascus in 1401 and fought the Ottomans at Ankara in 1402. His capital glittered with blue tiles and high domes, and his roads filled with baggage trains for armies as often as with bales for merchants. Samarkand regained splendor, but the long chain of steady posts that the great Khans had kept was gone. To the east, the Ming rebuilt with an inward gaze. In 1372, the great fort at Jiaiguan rose at the western end of the corridor as a new gate that looked more like a wall. The northern frontier was strengthened with bricks and watchtowers. The treasury rebuilt the canals and counted the grain with care. For a short time in the early 1500s, the court sent out treasure fleets under Zheng He that visited the straits and the Western Ocean. Those were sea roads that do not belong to this chapter. At home, the court lowered the importance of the old protectorates in the Tarim. Tribute envoys still came from the oases and from steppe rulers, and caravans still crossed with jade and horses and silk. Yet the state no longer tried to hold the far gates by garrison the way the Tang had done. The meaning of the western deserts changed from a road into a margin. In the lands of Islam, the disease returned in waves. Egypt saw new plagues in 1360 and 1368, and again in the next century. The price of grain rose and fell with each visitation, and Waqf houses struggled to meet their obligations when rent payers were gone. In Iran, the courts of the Jaliyirids and then of the Timurids tried to maintain coinage and postal routes between Isfahan and Herat and Nishapur. But each campaign stripped a district bare of draft animals and fodder. The new Turkmen confederations in the 15th century fought across Azerbaijan and eastern Anatolia and demanded tolls at bridges that earlier empires had allowed to pass with a posted rate. In the north, the Golden Horde gave way to smaller hordes, and the long river trade that had carried Samanid silver to the Baltic was now a patchwork of duties and feuds. Climate added a quieter cruelty. The 14th century marked the turn into a cooler time that later scholars call the Little Ice Age. Harvests failed more often on the margins of good land. Steppe grass recovered slowly after drought. Nomad camps pressed on oases whose rulers already feared their own weakened garrisons. Where the road had once depended on a relay of trust and force, it now met shortage and suspicion. A caravan master who had marched by calendar in the time of the great Khans now marched by rumor, and rumor is a poor guide. The ledger of loss is heavy, yet the road did not vanish from the earth. Local circuits survived and even prospered, where a stable prince could hold a valley and a pass. Kashgar still bought and sold, and so did Yarkand and Khotan, though they looked more to neighbors than to oceans of buyers beyond the mountains. In Iran and Transoxiana, the craft of weaving and the art of tile and miniature painting found patrons who wanted proof that their cities still lived. In China, the great inland markets adjusted to river muscle and coast wind more than to desert trail. The story of the Silk Road passed from present to memory as the main artery of continents, and the memory was already turning to legend while the last of the old caravan masters taught their sons how to judge a camel by its teeth and a guide by his hands. The Black Death did not close the Silk Road alone. The sickness weakened garrisons and emptied inns, and then politics, climate, and new ambitions finished the work. The unity that had stretched from the Danube to the Yellow River in the time of the great Khans could not be built again. And without that unity, the long land route could not hold its old place in the world. The next chapter belongs to those who learned to ride the monsoon, and to measure the ocean with an astrolabe and a line. The last life of the overland road faded while new roads rose on water. In the early 1500s, monsoon charts and compasses did what no camel could do. A ship that caught the southwest wind at the right month could run from Aden to Calicut in a matter of weeks. A ship that used the return wind could come back with hulls full of pepper and cotton. The old caravan learned that the sea had become a cheaper desert with better wells. China itself gave the first sign that the world would now be counted in harbors. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming court sent 7 great expeditions under Zheng He from Nanjing down the coast and out across the Indian Ocean. His fleets visited Malacca and Calicut and Hormuz and reached as far as the African coast. Tribute came back with giraffes and pepper and envoys. Then the court turned its face inward. The voyages ended. Officials rebuilt frontier walls, including the fort at Jiayuguan that locked the western mouth of the Hexi corridor in the early Ming, and they trimmed maritime trade to tribute and licensed exchange. The energy that had once held the oases was now poured into bricks and watchtowers on the northern rim. In the west, the hinge broke with iron and fire. In 1453, Mehmed II took Constantinople. The city that had long stood between Black Sea and Mediterranean became an Ottoman capital. Customs changed, tolls rose, and the last Roman door on the overland way closed to the Latin world. Venice kept trading through Levantine ports, but its ledgers began to show thinner margins. In 1400, 17 Selim I defeated the Mamluks and took Cairo and the Red Sea gates. The Ottomans now controlled the caravan lines through Syria and Egypt, and the ship passages from the Indian Ocean to Alexandria. Europe looked for a way around the bill. That way was found at the edge of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut after running down the coast of Africa, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and crossing the open ocean on the monsoon. In 1509, the Portuguese won at Diu against a fleet of Gujarat, Mamluk, and Arab ships. In 1511, Albuquerque took Malacca. In 1515, he took Hormuz and planted a garrison on the strait that led to the Persian Gulf. A network called the Estado de India grew from forts and trading posts at Goa, at Kochi, at Malacca, and at Hormuz. The Portuguese issued cartas passes to ships and demanded inspection and dues. A single carrack out of Lisbon could carry more cargo than a long train of camels. Cannon on a high-sided hull could speak louder than a coastal prince. Prices in Europe answered the new facts. Pepper that had passed through many hands across Syria now arrived through Lisbon in bulk, and the old middlemen could not match the cost. The Red Sea road did not die at once. The Ottomans and Egyptian merchants kept the spice route through Jeddah and Suez and Alexandria alive and stable for a time. Caravans still crossed the Sinai. Venetian galleys still loaded in Alexandria. But the balance at sea continued to tilt. The Portuguese learned to winter on the Indian coast, and to barter at Calicut and Cochin. They tried to block the Red Sea by patrolling off Aden. They sent missions to Ethiopian rulers and to the Gulf. The sea lanes began to knit a loop from Lisbon to Goa and back that looked like a mirror of the old overland arc. The shift touched Iran and Central Asia as well. In 1501, Shah Ismail founded the Safavid state. A century later, Shah Abbas the Great moved Armenian merchants from Julfa to a new quarter in Isfahan and built caravanserais and bridges to guide silk from the Caspian and from Gilan to his capital and to the Gulf. He opened Bandar Abbas on the Hormuz Channel. Persian silk still ran overland to Aleppo and to Bursa, where European agents bought it. But more and more it also ran to Gulf ships. Safavid roads and inns were grand works, and they kept regional trade alive. Yet the main river of world commerce had chosen another bed. Another wind rose off the North Sea. The Dutch founded the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie in 1602 and built Batavia on Java. The English founded the East India Company in 1600. Joint stock money and state charters added a new arithmetic to trade. The Dutch took Malacca from the Portuguese in 1641 and Ceylon after. They bought cloves and nutmeg in the islands and sold textiles in return. English and Dutch ships learned Chinese ports and learned the porcelain and tea trades in the 17th century. The ocean began to carry the very goods that had named the Silk Road. Silver gave the sea a deeper keel. From the 1560s, the Manila galleons ran between Acapulco and the Philippines with American silver in their holds. Much of that silver went into Chinese markets where coin and tax demanded metal. Some silver crossed the Indian Ocean into the bazaars of Gujarat and Basra. The flow of bullion through ships pulled value off the old land road. A caravan cannot match the weight that a three-decked galleon can carry when the wind is fair. The old way did not vanish in a winter. The oases still sold jade and cotton and grain to their nearer neighbors. Safavid, Iran, and later Afsharid and Qajar rulers built and repaired stone caravanserais at regular stages, some of which still stand with their square courts and corner prayer rooms. The Mughals in India promoted overland fairs that drew horses from Central Asia and cotton from the Deccan. Russia pushed east into Siberia in the later 16th century and created a new northern fur road. Yet none of these lines gathered the freight or the fame that the medieval land route had known. The cities that had once lived on tolls and camel traffic came to live on regional exchange. By the late 1500s, any traveler who tried to walk the long spine from the Yellow River to the Levant would have found stretches alive and stretches quiet, inns half empty, wells that needed repair, watchtowers with small garrisons and uncertain pay. In China, the Ming state paid more attention to coastal pirates and to the northern steppe than to far western protectorates. In the Ottoman lands, the tax farmers of Aleppo and Damascus still counted bales and set rates, but the richest cargoes were coming by sea to Izmir, to Venice, to Amsterdam, and to London. Lists of goods told the truth. Tea, porcelain, spices, cotton, and raw silk were now more often written beside the names of ships than beside the names of caravan masters. Two truths ended the age. The first was political. The Pax Mongolica that had once guaranteed a single overland passage was gone, and no later empire could hold so long and so wide a reach on land. The second was mechanical. A wooden hull with canvas and cannon beat sand and stone at scale. The Silk Road had bound continents for 1,000 years, but the world turned and found a cheaper path. The story does not close in bitterness. The Great Road left behind languages and faiths and arts that still speak to one another. Its cities remain books written in brick. Its memory still guides scholars and travelers who read the land. Yet as a main artery of the world, it had finished its course by the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th.